Okay, welcome, folks. This is an ad hoc meeting, ad hoc subgroup of the Clean Heat Standards Technical Advisory Group. Um, I'm Rick Weston, Chair of the TAG. Got a number of things we'll go through today. I'll talk about them in a moment. I'll start with our usual housekeeping. Please keep on mute unless you are speaking. Raise your hand in order to get into the queue for speaking. TAG members, please, if you can, keep your video on during the meeting and public your videos off until and unless you speak. We'll.
Rick, you're cutting out
I
a
am.
little bit.
I'm sorry. I don't know why.
Your audio is cutting in and out.
Yours isn't cutting out.
I can actually hear Rick pretty well, Catherine.
I mean, it's me off video.
Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, as always, we don't use the chat function except for links to documents as appropriate. With that, let's see. How many of us do we have? Just while I'm looking at about 8 of us. 7 or 8 of us, that's fine. Okay, the purpose of today's meeting is, it's multifold, but the core of it is to spend a little bit of time taking a look at various pieces of text that we will use to make decisions at our next meeting and the meeting after that, I would imagine, on issues that we have some disagreement about and we'll need to talk through and vote on. The idea here, as we talked last week, is to have pieces of text that express the relevant perspectives. In most cases, there are 2, but there might be 3 in some of them. And we want to go through those and just see if there's some, at the very least, some wordsmithing we might want to do on them before we review them again with the whole tag. And also perhaps talk a little bit about what they say and how best to express these perspectives. But before we do that, and we're at the end of this meeting, we'll talk about next steps and deliverables and so on. But before we do that, I thought we'd take a few moments just to hear TAG members' thoughts, if any, on the proposed rule that's come out and the companion memo with it. It came out right before our meeting last week. We didn't have it on the agenda, but I thought we'd just take a few moments to get some thoughts about it, and in particular, whether the rule itself does anything that we think we ought to respond to, says anything that we ought to respond to, or not. So with that, I'll open it up. And if it helps, I'll start off the conversation by saying that the rule, in my view, it looks much like I'd expected it to look, and that is process focused, in certain cases not specific on details about how certain things will be resolved. Every 3 years the PUC will review the clean heat standard as set out in statute, but what it will do and how it will do it is left outside the rule. And that makes sense to me, because what you don't want to do is have to revise the rule every time you want to change something in the something technical in the program itself. The analog for this is how the PUC handled qualifying facilities and the rates that they would charge under PURPA. The rule was set out all the processes, but the rates would be changed in a separate proceeding, so that you don't have to rewrite the rule every time you change the rates, that kind of thing. So I see it in many ways the same way. So I've regarded the rule as largely process and not of and there's not much there that I think the tag really needs to weigh in on, but if others feel otherwise, please say so. I'll also add that I think that the companion memo is really where the most important text is, and in particular, section 5 of the companion memo, which talks about the PUC's concerns about the CHS as it currently constituted. And what that might mean for legislative action starting in January. So, any thoughts, folks? Well, okay. I hope I didn't shut down conversation. Well, let me just ask, what I said, do you think I described the situation properly, or am I missing it entirely?
Rick, I just wanted to say for myself, I have been spending so much time writing up these memos for the tag on technical issues that I honestly have only just barely skimmed on the PUC stuff. So I don't have a fully formed perspective at this time.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. Well, good. Well, that's easy. That makes things easy. Well, then we'll turn to
Well, Rick, does that mean we'll still present open it up for the tag at the next meeting for an option? Okay.
We'll still talk about it, but it sounds like there won't be much said. We'll see. We'll see what others think. Okay, if you saw the agenda posted, it was we've got 3 additional categories of discussion points. The first is we want to pick up where we left off on our meeting last week.
Looks like Matthew has a comment before we keep going.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I didn't see that. Matthew.
Hey, Rick, thanks. Sorry, it took me a while to pull up my notes. I think my only comment on the rule is that I don't know if this is a department concern or just my concern that it doesn't specify that banked credits during GWSA performance years, Global Warming Solutions Act performance years, may cause a disconnect between attainment in that year and the actual requirement for the inventory. I don't know if the rule is the appropriate place to put a restriction if one is needed to say, maybe there's a limit on the amount of banked credits you can retire in a performance year, but that was kind of the only process issue I identified through what they've delivered so far.
I would certainly suggest that you chat with your colleagues at the department and determine whether a comment on that ought to be made and what that comment would be. But that's a good point. If you were to put a limit on the amount of bank credits that could be used, what would that look like? How would you describe that? Any thoughts?
I think the simplest solution is just that during performance years, there's no retirement of bank credits. That would be the simplest way of avoiding that issue, except there'll still be a discontinuity between the life cycle value and the inventory impact of credits.
Okay. I gotta think that one through. Yeah. Chat with your colleagues and come back to us next week if you think there's something that we ought to give some thought to. That'd be great.
We'll see if it stays in the comment.
Yep. Okay. I gotta think that one through a little bit more. Okay. We want to start by picking up where we left off last week. We had text and discussion on 3 matters. One is the question about heat pump hours of operation and the alignment between the draft TRM and what is currently and how heat pumps are currently being treated. And Emily Roscoe can speak to this. we want to talk a little bit about the definition of advanced wood heat again and see if the text that we've got and that we talked about serves our purposes for next week when we discuss when we take a vote on it. And then there's still also the question of the rate of decline in carbon intensity targets for biofuels. So with that, Emily, if I could turn to you on this question and focus in a little bit.
Yep. Real quick before I go into that, I know I told Rick and Catherine, but for the rest of the TAG members, we have Adam Sherman from EVT participating on the topic of wood as a subject matter expert. So when we get to that, and there's Adam coming on screen, he'll be participating, and I'm hopping off for an hour, but I'll be back. So yeah, just I think my update regarding consistencies with heat pump savings between EVT and Tier 3 and the numbers that we saw in the TRM, we have already talked to the department. Thank you to Matthew, and I think we're happy with just at this moment flagging it for the tag and continuing discussions with the department. And yeah, I think we just decided to not have any language to put forward for the group to flag for the PUC
at this point. Or just would you remind me where the inconsistency lies?
Yeah. So from my I'm just trying to remember from the last tag meetings notes, but from my memory, there is an inconsistency between the number and the calculation that EVT and Tier 3 uses for heat pump savings and the number given in the TRM, the Clean Heat Standard TRM, and there's considerable increase of savings in the TRM method than in the current existing programs and the way that they use that. So we just flagged that that's a major inconsistency and would cause a asymmetry in the clean heat standard market. But Efficiency Vermont Ben Plotzker has talked to, I think, Matthew and other members of the department, and I think those conversations will continue. And yeah, we just feel like we flagged it with the department in the tag meeting, and that's fine for now as long as folks are aware of that inconsistency.
Got it. And it is something that the department, makes a decision about. Is that correct?
Yes. Matthew, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. So as I understand, the department is responsible for providing input to EVT's TRM group. And that input is expected to come from the pending heat pump evaluation. The RFP went out earlier this year. Hopefully, if it aligns on the calendar, it'll be done sort of late 25, and then can be used as an input to update either TRM if change is needed. But to get specific on the difference, I believe the Opinion Dynamics TRM has a value of full load heating hours of around 1900 versus the EVT TRM for the same measure of around 1400. So that's where the measurable difference in savings comes from.
Got it. So, but at the very least, we'll want to conclude, I think, that it would be best if those were reconciled in some way or another.
Yeah, I think long term that is the ideal.
Yeah.
For the beginning of the program, the discontinuity may be tolerable.
Okay, so it's 1400 full load hours for current. Is that what it was?
Yeah, 1383 in EVT's TRM.
Right. Okay.
And 1909 in Opinion Dynamics, in case you're looking for that value in either document.
Yeah, nope, that's good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Matthew. Okay. Well, we'll stay tuned for that then. Okay. Shall we turn to the definition then of advanced wood heat? Catherine, do you want to put that up on the screen?
I can. Let me do that. Let me get it set up here. Got it. And I don't know, Emily Levin, would you be in a position just to reiterate what the options are and what you would, if you have a proposal for what to put forward to the tag? Ken is not here, so sort of, and you took this up very well last meeting.
Yeah, sure, I can do that.
Okay, step down definition of amnesty. Here it is.
Yeah, and let me just say again that our object here is to get the text to a point that we want to, put it in shape enough that we want to put it before the full tag for review, amendation, and discussion and vote next week.
All right, let's see if I've got. Where are my share screen options?
Be under more, I believe.
Yes, it's
Well,
just
or maybe not.
the documents here.
Oh, no, it's down below. It's on the toolbar down below.
Got it. Oh, I see. Okay. Get my faces out of the way. There you go. Big enough? Should I make it bigger?
Sorry, I muted myself again. Yeah, and then Catherine, I don't know if it's easy to turn off the paragraph markers. I just find those distracting.
No, not right now.
Okay. Yeah, so we walked through this at the last meeting. Option 1, the way Ken has written it here, is basically just to define advanced wood heat as kind of fully automated whole building systems. Option 2 is define advanced wood heating as basically anything and everything. Stoves, pellets, cordwood, all of the above, potentially tying some of those eligibility requirements to certain efficiency and or emission requirements, but more of kind of an all of the above approach. And then option 3, I think we had some discussion, if you can scroll down to option 3, about whether this is really an option. With advanced wood heat, there's sort of this question of, is it a fuel or is it an installed measure? And there are carbon intensity values associated with the wood or the pellets themselves, which is a separate discussion, and I believe more related to the work that ANR has been doing that we're hopefully going to discuss at another time. But should there simply be an option to, like, if you switch from just as one example, like a higher carbon intensity wood to a lower carbon intensity wood, and all you're switching is the fuel, like, should that be credited? I'm not sure whether folks want to consider that, or if we think that's a real option. I think the main questions relate to options 1 and 2 and how we actually define advanced wood heat as an installed measure. So I guess that's my impartial summary of this memo. Shifting gears to my own perspective here, I would note, I think we could refine these further. These are pretty quick and dirty descriptions, and I think we might want to break out option 2 a little bit more. Maybe option 1, I'm glad to see Adam Sherman here. I bet he could help us create a little bit of a more robust definition of a fully automated whole building advanced wood heat system. So we might be able to flesh out option 1 a little bit more. And then for option 2, it's possible there might be a couple of different options there. there are a lot of gradations within this. I have argued on behalf of NESCOM that there are problems with the emission certification for cordwood specifically, making it hard to develop a trustworthy standard for cordwood stoves in particular. So this option 2 could potentially be differentiated and articulated further with some like options within that, maybe one that's like, anything and everything, and one that maybe is like, how about just pellets, and here's why. So I think there could be a little bit more work to do on this one.
Thanks, Emily. That's a fine summary. I'm going to push back a little bit on one thing you said, the anything and everything. But option 2 does subject the technologies to performance standards. Okay, an efficiency standard, and you could in fact subject it to an emissions or set of emission standards if you wanted, particulate matter, for example. So the way I read it is, all it's saying is anything that meets the standard constitutes advanced wood heat. It doesn't mean everything constitutes advanced wood heat. That's
Right.
the only
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I still think there could be a range of options within option 2.
Sure.
Where you might have a set of efficiency and or emissions criteria that are more stringent or less stringent, that would allow for more or less of these different measure types to be allowable.
Okay. Adam, I'm just turned to you. Do you have any initial thoughts on this?
I do. So in Vermont, we have been incentivizing wood heating since 2011 and more kind of actively and with purpose since 2015. So these terminologies have been discussed at length with State of Vermont Clean Energy Development Fund that's funded some of the incentives through the small scale renewable energy incentive program administered by RERC, and then also alignment with Efficiency Vermont. So the terminology that we've kind of settled on, and that's kind of documented in various reports that we've done in collaboration with the state of Vermont, is that total wood heating includes all forms of wood fuels, cordwood, pellets, chips, and all types of appliances, stoves, furnaces, and boilers, without regard to the efficiency or sophistication of the combustion equipment. There's a lot of legacy wood heating that would be included in that, including old non-EPA certified stoves, as well as all the new stuff. So a sub bracket of that is then advanced wood heating, which would include all wood fuels, cordwood, pellets, and chips, and all high efficiency heating appliances, stoves, furnaces, and boilers installed indoors. And that definition generally maps back to the incentivized systems that are done through the state of Vermont and Efficiency Vermont, where there are clear efficiency and particulate matter emission criteria for the eligibility of that. And the purpose of that is to acknowledge that there's some really good technology out there that should be incentivized as best in class. And there's some, pretty crappy technology out there and should not be incentivized. So that distinguishing label of advanced wood heating is fuel and appliance specific in terms of the emission thresholds and the efficiency minimum requirements in those programs. And that often, or in my opinion, should be the dividing line, and that the definition used in the clean heat standard should map to that existing definition of advanced wood heat. I can drop a comment or some of that language from some of our work that we've done with the department on this, so that people have that. I mean, there's like a table defining that category. And then there's also the label of automated wood heating, which is like a subset of advanced wood heating, which is the automated fuel delivery of pellets and or chips. that's an automated fueling system where it's, you know, bulk fed into a boiler system. So I hope that kind of frames things up, but I would recommend that ultimately the definition mapped to what I just said around advanced wood heating and would have specific minimum efficiency and maximum PM emissions thresholds that map to those incentive programs, those pre-existing incentive programs.
Well, that's terrific, Adam. Is there a place where the definition is set out, you know, fully and thoroughly in one, you know, in a document or something somewhere?
Yeah, I can, depending on how the chat works, I may be able to just drop a screenshot in there. And there's a report that we did for the department in 2022, the baseline update. And yeah, I can check in with Chris Heine with the department, and I haven't seen it posted online, but I will double check that and maybe you can get that up there.
Yeah, if you can send it to Emily or to me or to Catherine, and we'll make sure it's you know, posted. Because it seems to me, I mean, what you've just said seems to me the intent of option 2 in this document. And if and Emily, if you know, it consistent with what you said, you know, that option 2 could use some improvement, it might make sense for option 2 to reflect exactly what Adam has said.
Yeah, if I could hop in here, I was going to suggest, and I'd be happy to work with Adam on this if he's amenable, but that we could flesh out options 1 and 2 a little bit to more directly point to those established definitions, both for fully automated systems in option 1 and for kind of emissions and efficiency based criteria in option 2. I would love to add maybe a different option 3, or maybe it's an option. I'm not sure if we're going to keep what the option 3 that Ken has listed, but again, shifting to my commenting hat, I would like the tag to consider an option where cordwood stoves are not included due to the flaws in the testing and certification program, specifically for those. That EPA Inspector General report that I mentioned at our last meeting came out after, it sounds like, this 2022 report that Adam did. And I think there may be some updates needed because we just don't have a good basis for knowing whether a cordwood stove that is listed as being certified on EPA's website, and which is the criteria that EVT is pointing to, is actually reasonable emissions level. Like, they're just all over the place. The whole testing program is a mess and being fixed right now, which is a long process. So anyway, I would love to be able to kind of more fully articulate an option that would allow the tag to consider that kind of flaw in the emissions testing and criteria program for cordwood.
Yeah, sorry, Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, we'll come back to you, Adam. And I have some thoughts too. Go ahead, Brian.
Sure. So I just quickly for Adam, whose definitions are these? And you can just drop that in the chat. Okay, it just was, for my notes, it just wasn't clear to me where these definitions are. Are they department definitions, or?
They're used in a report that that I wrote for the DPS, the Clean Energy Development Fund.
So are they Clean Energy Development Fund definitions, or are they department? And if there's no clear answer, are they VIC? I just don't know how to classify them. Yeah.
They were used to help structure a report that looked at the different sectors of wood heating and to quantify how much total wood heating is happening in Vermont and how much advanced wood heating is happening in Vermont. And I can drop the full report, send it to folks for circulation. But it's just a table within the document that helps organize our work to quantify these different sectors.
Okay, so and the department used these as the eligibility criteria for the incentives?
No, good question. The terminology was developed to clarify kind of organizational allocation of the heating sector in Vermont, but in general, the advanced wood heating term maps to the incentives that both the small scale renewable energy incentive program and Efficiency Vermont have in those incentives.
Okay,
So both.
that's good for now, I think. That was my question, and then I just I guess we can put this in the bike rack regarding like Emily's comment about the EPA certification and the NESCOM study, which I am looking at, but I'm trying to wrap my head around it. But I need to try and reconcile the the EPA certification program and the testing results from the NESCOM work, which is great and looks like it's very technically rigorous. But I'm just trying, it's the EPA certification program was about particulates and other pollutants, and you are classifying CO2 and methane emissions, but like this is I'm trying to understand how updated emission factors from there, or like not using the EPA certification or something, relates to how we're trying to tie life cycle greenhouse gas emissions to this achievement of the GWSA standards. And I'm not quite seeing how that happens yet.
To just respond to that, I think there are a couple sets of issues and projects going on. One is the GWP bio issue and life cycle accounting of the greenhouse gas emissions for the fuel component of wood. That is a separate conversation from the definition of advanced wood heating, and one that I think we'll get to later in this meeting. The scientific paper that I have shared with Brian, and I am planning to file this to the docket as well, has updated emissions factors that could be considered for those. Well, actually, I think that's a separate issue than GWP bio, but that's like a direct combustion. So those are updated combustion emissions factors that are part of the overall life cycle accounting for the wood fuels. And then whenever we get to the health impacts, there are also updated emission factors for other pollutants in there that could be used. That is somewhat distinct from the improvements to the EPA certification program, where EPA has funded this gigantic, like we have a $9 million grant from EPA to test new wood burning appliances and create an independent data set using new and improved test methods. So they're working towards a new source performance standard and like better testing methods and data to have like, so that there can be an EPA certification program for wood and pellet stoves that you can actually rely on, and that when you see a product listed on it, it actually has reasonably good emissions performance. That is sort of a distinct project that's still underway, and the data from that isn't going to be ready until late 2025, the first round, and it's going to be ongoing for the next few years. So that's not a quick fix. I don't know if that answers your question, but they're relating to like different parts of the wood issue. One is related to combustion emission factors, and then one is related to test methods underpinning the EPA certification program.
Right, and the focus is on criteria pollutants and particularly particulates, right? And I and I saw that there's a, like a CO2 and methane evaluation in your study. So they're not unrelated, but, like I said, your study was great, but it wasn't entirely clear to me, like how you would apply that, because it was like it was just stoves, and it was multiple appliances, and it was multiple fuels. And so I'm trying to figure out, it's like, oh, if we're going to use these emission factors or something based on that, or is this and it's all tied into like, the number 3 is advanced wood heat and installed clean heat measure, but that is evaluated for credits based upon the characteristics of the fuel, or is advanced wood heat wood fuels, delivered measure that has the same kind of an evaluation, and what are you comparing it to? So we're not going to answer that today, but that I think is like, I'm trying to understand in this space exactly how we are like evaluating the, this measure, because it's complicated the way it's treated in the act. And further complicated by what Adam said, right? It's like, we're already been incentivizing this for some period of time. So somebody thinks it's good.
I would just point out that in the flux of the EPA test methodology on efficiency is a real one, and it's not limited to cordwood heating systems. And so to evaluate technology that meets the state and Efficiency Vermont eligibility requirements, we also acknowledge and review EN 3035 test data as a means to have a broader sample and put less faith in the EPA test methodology, but that is certainly not limited to the cordwood stove test methodology. We also see highly erratic results in the boiler test methodology used by the EPA. So I'm saying that, but like, that's not a showstopper in terms of like applying rigor and evaluating the performance on both particulate matter emissions and efficiency. But, I think the PM is a pretty solid science. Like, that's clear, and the test methodologies are good. Efficiency is a little tougher.
Got it. So where does this leave us? What I've heard is that Emily has volunteered to work with Adam in the next few days.
Yeah, I voluntold Adam too. So.
Yeah, she volunteered Adam to clean this up, to rework the definitions so that we can address them at our next meeting. I have to say that I'm inclined, despite the complications that Brian just introduced to this discussion, I'm inclined not to see option 3 as one to consider. But this question, is it a dessert topping or a floor wax, is a good one. I get it, but I'm inclined to focus on again, the technologies and performance characteristics at this point, but that's just me.
I agree with that. I think it's confusing to have them, what we're talking about in this portion of the topic is just the criteria for installed measures to be eligible. And then, part 2, once those installed measures are determined to be eligible clean heat measures, when you actually calculate the clean heat credits for that includes the full life cycle impact, including the fuels. And that's true of like heat pumps, where we're trying to count, the life cycle grid emissions of the electricity provided to the heat pump. So I don't think there's anything like super unique about wood there. It does mean there's a whole part 2 of the conversation where there are a lot of questions and complexities to calculating the life cycle emissions for wood fuels related to both the combustion emission factors and the kind of the bio life cycles and all of those things that we'll discuss. But I feel like focusing this document on just part one of the conversation around the eligibility criteria for the installed measures is a little bit more clear.
I agree.
Would you be okay with that approach, Brian?
Well, at first I want to acknowledge that it's both a floor wax and a dessert topping, if I remember the episode correctly. And yeah, sure, that sounds reasonable to me, Emily. Thank you.
And Adam, you've been conscripted. Is that okay?
I'd be happy to help. Yeah, and I mean, I think option 2 is just fine tuning that is the most logical path forward, and it maps to, like, you know, the long history of programs and policies. I would just echo some of the comments that I think the equipment does matter. And with these devices, like, you're not going to switch from cordwood to pellets. Like, if you install, so we've looked at this both with the efficiency programs and the incentive programs that have been on the books for quite some time, but also this came up in the tier 3 in developing the tag for the tier 3 program. And like, are you incentivizing the fuel for these wood heating systems, or is it on the device? Luckily, the devices are engineered to only burn cordwood chips or pellets. So like making sure that you're only incentivizing best in class equipment that meet performance standards is vital. Once you have that piece of equipment in there, you can more or less predict and develop a tag around, okay, well, this size system and this size building will displace this much fossil fuel and utilize this fuel that has this carbon intensity. You can do it all on the device. And we have a long history of doing it in that structure. And that would be my recommendation. So the equipment and the standards distinguishing between run-of-the-mill technology and best in class, it's important public policy in the wood heating space. So I'm glad that you're tackling this and giving it a lot of good thought.
Well, thank you. And we're glad that you're now tackling it. Thank you. So Emily and Adam, you've got your marching orders, and it'd be great if we could have something to discuss in time for the next meeting. Really appreciate it. Your willingness to take that on.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And this might be a good time for me to note that I'm, rapidly trying to bone up on all these wood heat emissions issues. And during the next tag meeting, I am hoping to be able to call in, but I will be a passenger in a car, which is not ideal. And given all these wood issues that are likely on the agenda, I've asked an ESCOM colleague who's more expert in this to join, and also to provide some coverage while I'm in the car. So I just wanted to note that.
Is it a wood-powered car?
It is.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. Thanks all. Okay. Next, though, I think we're just going to be coming right back to you, Emily, is the document on rate of decline in carbon intensity standards for biofuels. The question of, step functions or a series of step functions or some sort of linear decline. Catherine's going to pull it up now. Do we feel that this document is in shape for consideration by the tag? Floyd's got his hand raised. Please.
Were there changes to this from the last discussion? Because I think I made my positions clear in the last discussion.
No, there haven't been any changes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think where we landed last meeting was, Emily and I agreed to disagree. My points were, that, just to sum it up, you either do stepwise for all the fuels, or you do, linear or some other progression for all the fuels. I mean, basically, treatment of all the fuels to the same sort of schedule. I think that's the intent and spirit of the clean heat standard, or the affordable care heat. And so it doesn't make sense to me to apply one set of standards to one set of fuels and then another set of standards to another. It just, that doesn't make sense to me, and it doesn't seem consistent with the act.
Well, then what does that mean for the document itself, Floyd?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because that's, yeah, if
I mean, I know we broached the kind of the principal view versus minority report, approach before. I don't know if that's the right way to do it.
Well, it seems to me, at the very least, if we have a document that expresses alternative perspectives, and then the tag sits down and says, and we vote on them, and 8 people say, I like option 1, and 7 people say, I like option 2, that is an expression of majority and minority preferences. So in a sense, you capture that just in the vote itself. And again, I'll just emphasize this, if the document says what it needs to say in order to do so. So that's why I ask, is there something we should say here that's not been said that you think should be included?
I mean, if I read this option 1, as I read it, it seems to me the intent of option 1 is to eliminate a set of eligible fuels earlier than otherwise they would be. And that to me is an inappropriate use of the compliance schedule.
Okay.
But I think that's an opinion, not.
Let me, Emily, Matthew had his hand up. Let me go to him. Matthew Bakerpool?
Yeah, Floyd, it almost sounds like you're advocating for TAG taking a position to amend the statute. As I read it currently, there is an explicit sort of different treatment for, it says liquid and gaseous, but really the implication is on fossil fuels, that those carbon intensities are basically almost phased out unless they can keep up with whatever decline is set either through the rule or by the bare minimum in the statute. I hear what you're saying, that it's a disparate treatment between the fuels, and generally I think people would oppose something like that, except for where the legislature has explicitly said that that's how the rule should function. I'm not sure if I understood correctly.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm talking specifically about biofuels, and the bullets under option 1 appear to me intended to structure a compliance schedule that's intended to phase out those fuels sooner than they might otherwise be if it was based solely on an objective analysis of carbon intensities and the statutory framework. Because the statute has 2 reduction targets, right? And it says, publish the rate at which carbon intensity values shall decrease annually. That doesn't mean that doesn't mean a linear decrease. It just means, you shall have a schedule that shows you are, you're reaching the target at some point specified in the statute. To me, a stepwise compliance schedule meets that requirement, meets that test.
Before we go further, let me just jump in. Catherine, can you scroll back to the top where the options actually are? Because what I'm seeing is the discussion of the options, and that's just okay. Yeah. We haven't,
No, it's at the very top.
yeah, at the very top, option 1, option 2. It's really pretty straightforward. Should option 2 is simply to do, to do what opinion dynamics has done, which is just kept the targets, in the step function as, starting in 2030 and 2050. The statute does talk about, it's really interesting as a matter of statutory construction, whether the statute is actually calling for the PUC to publish annual declines in the CIs or to publish annually what the CIs are. It's interesting. We can have a fun discussion about where adverbs ought to go. And it's in the second interpretation that I see Floyd's point. But without all the discussion, merely the question is, should the tag encourage, and I would change this linear annual decline. I mean, I think that's problematic because of what I just said, but maybe not. I mean, we can argue the statutory construction. But the question is, should the tag say the step down, the 2 step downs are fine, or should there be further declines between 2030 and 2050? And I think that's a fair question.
Yeah. And I
So
think
Floyd, go ahead.
I just wanted to emphasize, I think for today's meeting, the question is, are the options captured reasonably to facilitate a tag discussion and vote on the issues at the next meeting,
Yes.
and not like
Yeah.
to actually rehash all the perspectives, because I think it's likely we will not all agree and the vote will reflect that. From that perspective, I do think there are a couple things that we could consider tweaking. We could add another option or modify option 1, because it doesn't have to be a linear annual decline. It could be a decline at a different pace, or it could be steps at more frequent increments, like every 3 years or every 5 years it steps down, instead of just one big step in 2030 and, one step in 2030 and then another giant step in 2050. So we could articulate that as an option, which might be helpful, because it may be that people don't support option 2, but also don't support a linear annual decline and think it should be another pacing. So that's one suggestion, is to maybe flesh out an option 3 that's like, decline between 2030 and 2050 on some sort of predetermined schedule, TBD. That might be another option. And then I just wanted to note there's an error in the one of the sections. If you go to the next page, Catherine, if you're in a Word document, you can maybe just correct this, because this is just a mistake. But it should say it's in not this section, the one above this. No, not that one, the one below that, the one at the top of page 2. In the middle of the first paragraph, the PUC proposal did not take a position on how carbon intensity values for liquid and gaseous fuels should decline from 2031, and that should be 2050 and not 2025. I just mistyped. So I would like that correction to be made. But the more substantive point is to consider adding a third option for some other pace of decline between 2030 and 2050.
Okay.
And I guess we're never going to get through today if we actually have the debate. So I'm hoping
not having the debate, Emily, but we wanted to understand.
Yeah.
You're right. But needed to understand what might be missing from the document.
Can I make one suggestion?
Yes,
Rick and Emily. Typically when you're doing an analysis of, a position that's been put out there by, an entity like Opinion Dynamics, opinion 1 is kind of the don't change anything from that. And this is, the opinions or the options have been switched around. So can I suggest that option 1 be, maintain Opinion Dynamics suggested approach, and then option 2 be linear or otherwise. I mean, that just seems like the standard format for doing this sort of analysis of different options.
That sounds like a good idea. That's easy.
I actually disagree with that because I think opinion dynamics was pretty clear that this was not a suggested approach. This actually came up and they were like, this is not the suggested approach. This is just, it was outside the scope of their work. And so it was just a referenced approach.
Okay, Sam,
I'd like to request that we take a look at the discussion for option 2 around, where it says that certain technologies are going to be eliminated from the program. I mean, I brought this up previously, but I think it's inappropriate in this document to sort of predetermine or guess that these technologies will be ineligible because the carbon intensity score gets to a certain lower level. And I know we've talked about this before, but there's a lot of information out there to suggest, including a really good recent report from the International Energy Agency, which shows, they basically expect all of these different fuel pathways to be well under that threshold by 2050. So I'd like to take that out of this just for fairness. So we're not putting something like that on the record.
thanks. Emily? You've still got your hand up.
Sorry, I meant to put my hand down, but I just thought that was useful for articulating the potential impacts for discussion purposes. Do you think that's inaccurate, Sam?
I think it's inaccurate, yes.
Maybe a quick qualifier was added that says something like, based on current projections of carbon intensity scores, subject to change in the future. The language could be softened.
So I just want to push back a little bit. I mean, we probably a couple months ago now, we had talked about changing some of the projections for the carbon intensity scores to better reflect that energy inputs would change over time and that processes would change over time for the biofuels production pathways, which would result in a much lower carbon intensity. And unless I missed something, I don't think that was ever incorporated into the estimates. So, like, as far as I can tell, this doesn't incorporate accurately estimated changes in carbon intensity score. And I know it's sort of a nit here, right? But like, I just want to make sure that we're not preordaining something in one of the memo documents that we're putting out to the tag and to the rest of the community.
I appreciate that, Sam. Thank you. Okay. Well, we need to do some rewriting of this document then. Emily, you're going to be busy with the other document. I can take on the rewriting of this, the amendments to this, and try to come up with an option 3 or at least a reworded option 1 or 2. We'll decide that as well on how to not confine the choices to simply linear. If I'll volunteer to do that, unless someone else wants to.
That would be great. I've made a couple notes, which I'll send to you, Rick, and you can consider.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'll check in with folks to make sure I've caught your sense. And I'll try to incorporate, as disparate as they are, the comments made today, just now. Thank you. Okay. Is there anything else on this topic? Okay, 10:30. Okay, now, we were going to take a look at, if available, we were going to take a look at early drafts of discussions on counterfactuals for biofuels, for the treatment of land use change for biofuels, and wood fuel, carbon intensities and other issues. In the case of wood fuel carbon intensities, I don't think we're ready. Brian was going to take the lead on that, and I don't think we're prepared for that. Is that correct, Brian?
That is correct, Chair Weston. We're working hard on it, but we are not prepared to discuss today.
Right. That's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's realize this is time intensive for folks, for all of us. For the use of counterfactuals for biofuels, Sam and Emily were on that. I think you've been going back and forth, but are you ready to discuss that, or do you want to or I mean, how do you want to tell us where you stand, and then we can decide how to proceed?
Yeah, so Emily, thank you again for quick turnaround on that from yesterday afternoon to now. I gave it a quick look, and as long as we're sort of discussing what the document should look like, if you want to accept the changes that you have there and put it up, I'm happy to discuss and sort of refine that now if you feel like you're ready to do that, Emily.
I think that would be helpful because this is a big issue, and yeah, so this is a little more drafty maybe than the prior document, because Sam and I haven't really had a chance to go back and forth a lot directly, but I think in the interest of getting a higher, like a more refined version that we can share with the tag next week, it would be good to talk through whether the different positions are articulated effectively.
Great, let's do it. Catherine, I'm assuming that you sent this to Catherine and me just at 9:30. So if Catherine, you have it, could you put it up?
Why don't I put it up if that's okay? Would that be all right?
Well, yeah, but
Because I've got it up already, and I might I could probably like do some editing. Let me just I'm gonna do what Sam suggested, and
well, let's put it up and let everybody read it. Take a few moments to read it.
yeah, no, I was just accepting the changes which Sam had suggested because otherwise it's super messy.
Oh, good. Okay.
I did send this, I think, to the whole subgroup, but it was like 3 minutes before the meeting, so one thing I did, Sam, was try to create, just like pull the actual statutory language in full, because I think it's helpful to have that in these documents for reference.
Let's take a moment and read it. Are folks ready to scroll maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs up?
Yeah, so then we get into the arguments. There's arguments for inclusion of counterfactual emissions, which Sam drafted, and then there's arguments for exclusion of them, which I drafted, and which, again, neither of us have really had a chance to like fully absorb and edit. I'm gonna just keep going down to the arguments. Are folks ready for me to scroll down to the arguments for exclusion section?
I'm still in the other one, but scroll slowly and that'll be fine. Yeah, thanks.
So, Rick, when do you want comments?
I'm still reading it.
Okay,
Which is I'm slow here. There's a lot here.
there's a
But
lot here. Yeah, I just spotted a sentence that drew my attention, but we can talk about it at the end.
yeah, let's just give me a couple more. I'm a slow reader. I don't know about others. But give me another moment. Is this the last of it, Emily? The italicized?
Yeah, that's the end, thankfully.
Okay, yeah, okay. Well, obviously, this is a very quick read for folks, and we're not, just once again, reminding folks that what we're trying to do is articulate the perspectives that we are going to vote on eventually. So with that in mind, Floyd.
I just saw a sentence. It had something to do with the counter. Yeah, here. Let me see. Here, but for that, like in the middle of that paragraph there or that bullet, but for that crop source biofuel land use change would not have happened. I guess I would disagree with that. And we can talk about that some more during, my write-up, discussion of my write-up. But I think there's a lot of debate about that particular point. For example, if you look at the land use change modeling for soybean, for example, the models suggest there would be a land use conversion change in the U.S. Because of the biofuel policies, but that has not been the case. And so I think making a broad statement like that, I think, is inaccurate. It just, it fails to factor in improvements and innovations in the crops, in the yields per acre, biotechnology improvements, other sort of things. So it's not a given that the presence of or the use of a crop to extract a portion of it to make a biofuel necessarily results in land use change, either direct or indirect.
But I think I'm happy to have that discussion when we get to your write-up, Floyd. I think there's a separate discussion on land use change. I'm happy to edit for the purpose of making this point. I don't think it's critical. So I'm happy to edit it in some way. The larger point relates to kind of how you draw the boundary for the life cycle analysis that, is it a true part of like, it absolutely must be part of the feedstock for
No, sorry, I get that, but I didn't want this sentence to show up in this memo from, in front of the tag, whereas I'm saying something the opposite in my memo. They're contradictory.
So if you can suggest alternative language that would help kind of draw this distinction. I just deleted crop sourced as a starting point, but I'm trying to just articulate this point, and I realize that the three people with their hands up all disagree with this point, so you're probably not going to help me articulate it better, but
yeah, I'll in the interest of time, I'll defer to Patrick and Sam.
Patrick?
Yes. Hi. First, Sam and Emily, thank you for taking the time to draft this. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate all the perspectives. I think that yeah, most of my comments are in the related to the arguments against, but Emily, in this first section you have up here, well, first of all, there's a couple places where it seems like there's some editorializing in this whole section, like cherry picking, and the Jim Duffy quote that just don't seem to me to be appropriate for a tag document to have editorializing like that in there. But to go to your really the end of this same paragraph that Floyd was talking about, where you say, it's not the case, however, that the manure lagoon creating the emissions would not have existed but for the clean heat measure in Vermont. I think I agree with that, but it is significant that there are in Vermont and many other states, as states implement the Clean Water Act, they have made regulations that require farms to have like 180 days of manure storage, which requires farms to have lagoons. So this is really happening, and there are mandates that are deriving it as part of public policy around the country. So I think that's one thing that's significant. Another is just the last sentence here. If you're going to account the emissions from the manure lagoon, then you also need to account for all the other emissions associated with the agricultural operations. I understand the point. Those agricultural operations also have other products, with a dairy farm being milk and meat, and you would get into co-product credit allocation there on the one hand. And historically, how this has been handled in life cycle assessments is that the milk and the meat are considered the primary products from those agricultural operations, and the manure is considered a waste and doesn't get charged with the upstream emissions. So if I'm not sure if you're suggesting that all of the upstream emissions should be accounted towards the RNG. If that's the case, then I absolutely agree. I absolutely disagree. But in the very least, there would need to be much more nuanced analysis of the LCA in that respect. That's just my first comment. I have several others.
Okay. Well, do you want to make those comments now?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Going down a little bit, if you can skip. Yeah, I already commented on that one. same thing, like this feels like editorializing, but also the state level implementation of Clean Water Act requires farms to have lagoons. So that's in part why I wouldn't agree with Jim Duffy here, despite undoubtedly his experience with programs like this. Your next comment on the distortionary impact in the CHS program. I know we talked about that several weeks back. I think it just needs to be flushed out and explained if it's going to be in here. And then going down a couple more points to including counterfactuals could make electrification and weatherization pathways less competitive with RNG, even those measures are more directly tied to Vermont's thermal sector. I know this is something that other people understand better than I do, why there is not a RNG or why there's not a biogas to electrification thermal pathway, and maybe I just should let this issue go to bed. But if there were, there would be incentive for more farms in Vermont to produce renewable electricity from their manure, leading to more methane emissions in Vermont, something for which Vermont has no other policies to create methane emissions from, no other greenhouse gas specific policies, as I understand it, under the Global Warming Solutions Act. That a pathway like that, as part of the clean heat standard, leading from biogas to electricity used for thermal purposes, would be an electrification option, leading to more methane emissions from farms in Vermont. Many farms in Vermont it's not going to be viable for them to produce RNG. They're either too small or too far from natural gas lines, but producing electricity is a viable option for many of them. And then the last, basically the last
Just
bullet.
pause you there for a second, because you
Sure.
said, you're saying that allowing that pathway would create more methane emissions, but I think what you mean is methane emission reductions.
Yes, sorry if I misspoke. Absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure I understood the direction there.
Thank you for catching that. And then the last bullet point here with the italics, it seems to be related to RNG leakage, and the quotes from Greet seem primarily related to RNG leakage, which is a separate issue unrelated to the counterfactuals. And I don't want the two to be confused. So I know there's a lot said in those paragraphs there, but RNG leakage questions are separate.
Okay. Is it anything else, Patrick?
No, that's pretty much it.
Sam's up next, but Sam, if I can just interject, Patrick, on the biofuels to electric generation to thermal use pathway, I think you're right to conclude that you're not going to win that one. It's we certainly capture the we should be capturing the methane reductions from that in our assessment of the electric grid. One could, I mean, if one actually were to burn, RNG from a manure lagoon to generate electricity to then heat a house with a heat pump, and that was, and it's fully sort of self-contained, a closed system. I'd see the argument. But the moment the electricity has anything to do with the grid, you've got all kinds of other issues you want, in my view. So, but there you go. I used my position as the chair to interrupt or to jump in front of Sam. Sam?
Yeah, thanks. No problem, Rick. Just quickly, I think Patrick hit both of the points that I had, but wanted to plus one on the point about GREET. I mean, I think it's important to consider how GREET may change over time, and to the extent that there is a Vermont specific GREET used for this program, I think there's hopefully no disagreement in the group that it should be updated over time and that all these things are important. I do think what you've highlighted here, Emily, isn't necessarily saying that they are getting rid of counterfactual, right? It's more just saying that they might take a new look at what that counterfactual calculation looks like in terms of how much emission reduction they provide. So maybe just flagging that. I do think leakage is slightly separate and have a lot to say there, but it's also an important part of this. So I don't necessarily mind having that in one of these documents. On the point around the Jim Duffy quote, I mean, if we were using CARB officials and ex-CARB officials' viewpoints to determine the outcome of these issues under the Vermont tag, I would be very happy because I think I could cite many other examples in the other direction here. But for the sake of this, we should probably exclude it.
Yeah, if I could just respond to those points, I'm happy to take out this Jim Duffy quote. I recognize it's a little bit more of an opinion, but I also was kind of in the section where I'm trying to articulate a viewpoint. With that said, this was just helpful for me in kind of thinking about it, that like this is pollution arising in another sector. So I actually did find it to be like substantively helpful. But so that's why, but I am happy to take it out. I'll just delete it. On the GREET point, yeah, I mean, this whole point reads like, if I lose this fight and we do include avoided methane, this point is just saying like, don't necessarily just accept the GREET defaults as the be all and end all. So yeah, happy, but I also agree with Patrick that this isn't really related to the counterfactual point either. So we can nuance this a little bit.
Patrick?
Yeah, appreciate the good discussion. On this subject of GREET doesn't handle this whole subject well. GREET doesn't handle the operations of farms well. GREET is extremely coarse in respect to this subject. Other jurisdictions have handled it by matching the parts of GREET that it does do well, which are related to the fuel production, with other very well established methodologies for accounting for methane emissions. That certainly makes things more complicated. There are efficient ways to do it that would be far superior, in my opinion, far more accurate than relying on GREET, because GREET is extremely coarse in this regard. And I'm happy to, yeah, if there's interest in doing that, I'm happy to work with people to explain it and lay out an efficient way to do it.
Thanks, Patrick. Let me just jump in and say, and just remind us and myself what this document and what all these documents are intended to do. They are intended to set out the perspectives on issues that have been contentious and to allow the tag to express its opinion on them. And my intention is to take up or down votes, essentially up and down votes on these when these documents are in sufficient shape for that to happen. And so the tag will say, 7 to 8, 12 to 4, 3 to 12 or whatever, the numbers are. And that at least tells the PUC where the tag is coming from. As always, folks are perfectly free to, and I encourage them to file their own thoughts on these issues with the PUC, disagreeing with or agreeing with what the tag, majority. And again, we're we're only going to say that there's a tag decision on something if it's a strong majority, which I think we've defined, and Catherine can jump in on this, as 10 votes in favor of something, at least 10 votes. But what I want to say here is that all the discussion in these documents, the pros and the cons, or the arguments for, the arguments against, I think they should be written in a way that is as neutral as possible. You know, I agree with Patrick that we ought to avoid some editorializing, and I'll even say that, and I'll say as well that there's some language in Sam's part of this document that I think needs to be toned down a little bit. But that's all fine. What we want to do is be able to, it seems to me, we want to lay out the arguments for and against as succinctly and as much in an anodyne manner as possible, so that the PUC will know what it was we were considering. It's okay if there are statements in these documents with which people don't agree, and possibly even arguments about what the facts actually are. So I'm not as concerned about whether something in here is true. You know, I agree with this, it's true, this, we know what the facts are. That's part of the area of disagreement in some of these, but I would like the documents to be as I say, as neutral on these matters as possible, you know, in wording. And I'll leave it at that. If that's helpful, I hope it is. And in
Well,
the end,
thank
we're
you
just-
for volunteering, Rick, to take a pass over this document and make it more anodyne.
Is that what I just did? Well, I certainly will jump in. I'm happy to help on this one. I've got the other one. Sure. I mean, you guys are going to keep me busy for the next few days when I'm happy to do. But okay, I guess I just got volunteered. I'll take a first stab, and then it'll go back to Sam and Emily. The idea here is that we know that there are disagreements on the tag on these issues, and that they are likely to be unresolved. So now we just want to capture the issues as succinctly, as clearly as possible, and give the PUC an idea of where the tag is on these things. I think that's, unless others think otherwise, I think that's the best we can do at this point. And I think it's important, and I think it's good. I think it's good. Don't get me wrong. I think this effort is really important. Any other thoughts? My cat is throwing all my papers around. Well, if that's where we stand, then I'm going to take a first look at this, share it with Emily and Sam, and we will put something together for the tags review next week. And if the tag is prepared, feels that the document's in shape and is prepared to take some kind of vote on it, that'd be great. If not, we go back to the drawing board. Lloyd.
Just to close out the discussion on the Jim Duffy doctrine here, just to footnote it a little bit. So Jim was an employee of mine. I worked at CARB for 32 years. I just want to point out for everyone, in case you didn't know, Jim was the manager of the LCFS program when it established the dairy digester projects, and specifically the setting of the system boundaries based on the GREET model to account for avoided methane. So I just want to make that point. Not quite sure why he's landed where he's at now, but he was the manager of that program when those projects were approved using that system boundary with avoided methane.
Thanks, Floyd. Okay, folks, thank you very much. Okay, well, so we've got some to-dos. Good, okay. So where are we next? Oh, Floyd, it's your turn. Treatment of land use change for biofuels. Are we ready to discuss that or no?
I think we're ready, if Emily's ready.
So we have two versions of the document. I have the one with Emily's edits that I can share, or your.
Why don't you put up the red line version from Emily?
Okay.
And this will be pretty straightforward. I think we'll be done in 5 minutes compared to the last one. I don't think we're in a position to put it in front of the tag. It's similar to the last one. I think it's at the draft stage, and I apologize to Emily. We haven't been able to work on this together yet. So I put this draft together. Emily provided her comments and suggested edits. Why don't I just walk through it, and rather than have you guys read it line by line, let me just see if I can capture the gist of my part at least, and then Emily can. Am I coming through okay?
Yeah, no, I was interrupting. I think that's a good idea. I just want to, but what you are saying is that this document is not ready for prime time for the tag, that we're going to go through it and then you and Emily have more work to do. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's the right time to get the conversation started and to get the, at least the members on the call here thinking about it.
Right.
Because these are important issues. And there's differing opinions, obviously. And I do take to heart your suggestion to keep it neutral, factual and all of that stuff. I think Emily pointed out some editorializing that could be refined a little bit. So
heaven forbid.
Yeah, I know, heaven forbid. On the facts thing, I think it is important to get the facts right because the tag members will be considering all of the factual materials. So we'll try to get that straight as much as possible.
I agree, Floyd, and I didn't mean to suggest that there are, two sets of legitimate facts in any case. I mean, this is something we're dealing with in American political discourse
Well,
now.
yeah, I mean, we all know there's facts and there's alternative facts, right?
Right. In this case, what there aren't are any facts about the future.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
There you go.
Good enough. Other than it's uncertain. Okay, so just real quickly. So the question that we're posed in this write-up is, how should, if at all, land use change should be considered in the setting of life cycle carbon intensities for, I think in this case, it's specific to biofuels. So that would be liquid and gaseous, as Emily pointed out. And then the opinion dynamics proposed approach, and I think we both agree that is it's framed as a proposed approach, was that assume there's no change in land use, either direct or indirect, associated with the biofuel that needs to be quantified in the emission rates. And they set out a number of bases for that. First and foremost is that the GREET model that they are using is inconsistent in the accounting of land use change in the fuel and feedstock. I think specifically there are very explicit inputs and assumptions used for soybean, but there are none or there's not the same level of inputs and assumptions for canola and other sort of potential crop-based feedstock. So I think making those, adding that complexity into GREET to make it consistent, I think is going to be a daunting task that would be taken up, I think, by the Argonne folks, and that requires heavy duty industry surveys and data gathering and all that stuff. I don't think it's and as we'll talk about later, I don't think that's really going to yield meaningful results anyway. Open Dynamics pointed out that simplifying the assumptions makes a TRM that's easy to use and much more implementable and replicable. And I thought they brought up a really good point, which is that crop-based biofuels, for purposes of programs like this, are made or grown predominantly in the Midwest U.S. That's on dedicated land that is, in order to qualify for renewable fuel standard credits, had to have been in agricultural production prior to 2008. That's an important point because that then implicates whether there will be land use change in response to this policy in the first place. And then they also brought up uncertainty around the demand for fuels nationally, and then Vermont's relative contribution to that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I structure this as option one being excluding the land use change. I think Emily disagrees with that, but to me, that's a standard format. Option one is maintain the proposed approach. Option two being the opposite of that, which is to include land use change. Before we get into
I'm fine with that approach for this one. I just moved it down because I thought it might be helpful to have the statutory requirements first before discussing the options. So it's down there. It's just
oh, I see. Okay. We can talk about that. I think it's important to have it up front because it puts the statutory and technical considerations into context. So we'll talk about the technical considerations, but I wanted to put up front the statutory considerations because I think those are important guidelines and directives that we all need to consider. And so I added in some provisions from Act 18. I think Emily also suggested some other ones. I think from my point of view, the relevant ones are 8128A3, which talks about, which really is structured so that it discusses land use change as a retrospective analysis. In other words, it describes the duties of the Technical Advisory Committee or group in assisting the commission, the PUC, to periodically assess and report on the sustainability of the clean heat measures by considering various factors, including land use change. So it's a retrospective activity. And then when you couple that with, I kind of missed this, and I'll add it to a revision to this 8127H, which is a review of consequences. And again, that states the commission shall biannually assess harmful consequences that may arise in Vermont or elsewhere from the implementation of specific types of clean heat measures, yada, yada, yada. Such consequences shall include public health, environmental burdens, deforestation or forest degradation, conversion of grasslands, and so forth. I point that out because deforestation or forest degradation and conversion of grasslands are the typical sort of environmental impacts one uses or cites when you're talking about land use change. And so it seems to me that when you couple those two things together, it seems to me the legislative intent is not to incorporate land use change per se up front in either the CI scores or the targets, but to assess whether the CI scores and targets have an impact after the adoption and implementation of the program. I also added 8127, which should be C and G, talks about the CI, the credits and targets being based on life cycle carbon intensities that are verifiable. And we'll talk about that particular term later on. So if you can scroll down. Okay, so in terms of support for option one, again, which is to exclude land use change. And when I say land use change, I'm really talking about indirect land use change, although You could consider a direct land use change in there as well. The models don't really distinguish between them or can't really tease them out. But for everyone here, make sure we're all on the same page. So indirect land use change or induced land use change is based on the theory that, when you take a feedstock, for example, and use it for biofuel production here in the US, you're going to cause somewhere in the world someone to clear land that wasn't being used for agricultural purposes and convert that to a lipid production to make up for the lipids that were used for biofuel production in the US. Sounds simple enough, very difficult to assess. By definition, it's not something you can measure directly, but it's inferred. The attempt is to infer it through computer modeling. And that computer modeling is, controversial, highly uncertain, and depends on the assumptions, the inputs, and the expertise of the person doing it. So just to bring back to the statute, there's no explicit requirement in the statute for incorporating land use change in the CI scores. As I mentioned, nothing in 8128 or 8127. And really, when you look at 8128 and 8127 together, it appears to me that the legislature intended to have a look back at whether land use change was impacted by the CHS, but not necessarily incorporate it into it. And I think that's an appropriate reasonable and cautionary approach. I think if you can, and then the next bullet is opinion dynamics. I think identified some sound and reasonable basis for excluding land use change. Not consistent treatment within GREET itself, so it's difficult to do that. I would point out ILUC modeling, we've done that ourselves. Other agencies have. This is a exercise that takes, that costs tens to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars based on the complexity of the analysis that's requested, and it requires a high degree of expertise. I mean, I certainly couldn't do it on my laptop. But when you look at the history of indirect land use change modeling, I think there's a clear trend, and this is because this was a highly speculative concept when it was raised in 2008 or so, and the data on land use conversion has been refined since then, and it's shown that the original estimates were highly overestimated. So as I pointed out here, and I mentioned before, the early estimates were 300 plus grams CO2 equivalent per megajoule for indirect land use change. And then over the years, that's gone down to 60 and then down to 29.1. The most recent estimate was 9.1 to 9.7 by Purdue in June of last year. And that was using a shock or a volume of biofuels or feedstock used for biofuels that was 4 times greater than what CARB used, and resulted in 1/3 the indirect land use change estimate. So I think and that's at a California scale volume. Compare that to Vermont's 100 million or so. I think it's, whatever results you might get out of the indirect land use change modeling would essentially be noise. I would also point out that the capacity to produce soybean and canola in the North American market is far more than and can easily absorb Vermont's demand. The World Agricultural Economic and Environmental Services did modeling in February of last year where they projected 609 million additional bushels of soybean in 2030 from the same acres used in 2022. And I don't have that in here. I'll add it to it. What that translates to is more than 900 million additional gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel potential. So that's 9 times the volume that Vermont could need if we were to do 100% conversion of the liquid biomass or liquid diesel use in the heating sector. And that's just from biotechnology improvements alone. That's not from improved crush, improve farming techniques and all of that stuff. So, and then finally, as I point out, the indirect land use change inclusion, if it were included, would be, in a direct conflict with 8127, since it's not directly measurable, it's inherently unverifiable, and therefore it would be inconsistent with section 8127's requirement for verifiability. I'd also point out that I think Canada in their clean fuels program does not include ILUC in their program for variety of reasons, one of which is the lack of verifiability. So let's see, was there anything else there? And that's the option 1 discussion. I'll invite Emily to chime in on option 2.
Thanks, Floyd. Emily?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a opinion dynamics. If you go to the second bullet, it's not that they don't think it's appropriate to include them. Like there's sort of the philosophical, like, is this an appropriate part of the life cycle? And I would argue that it is. Like this is part of the life cycle. If we're going to do life cycle emissions accounting, we should account for the full life cycle. That's a little bit of a distinct question from how do you actually go about doing it and what is the technical complexity of doing it. But I think it's pretty clear that the statute does require, and the fuel pathways does require, looking at, land use changes as part of the feedstock part of the cycle. So I guess I would like to sort of just divide this conversation into the philosophical, like, should this theoretically be included? And then there's this follow-up question of like, can it realistically be included given the complexity, which you might come to a different answer around. But I think that it's pretty clear that it should at least theoretically be included as part of life cycle emissions. And I think one of the challenges here is that it's one of my concerns, I guess, as having just articulated the con view on including counterfactual emissions for RNG, is that we're being very generous, including, also difficult to measure parts of the life cycle and the feedstock for RNG, because we want to include those, but then we're making a decision, well, this is too complicated, so we'll just exclude it. So it sort of feels like the decisions are not consistent. Like we're not, we're including the full life cycle in one place, or arguably going beyond even the full life cycle by counting emissions that really are associated with agricultural production and not even the fuel. But then over here, we're not including the life cycle emissions. So it just feels like there's sort of an inconsistency in a way that always seems to land in favor of biofuels. So we exclude it when biofuels prefer to exclude the land use change, but we include it when we don't want to include the counterfactual, you know what I mean? I think I've made the point, but I would agree there are some complexities to doing it, but I think there are some sort of simplifying assumptions. Like CARB and the LCFS has created default land use change assumptions for use that we might be able to draw on here, rather than just saying it's too difficult, let's exclude it. And so I think there are some precedents that could be done here. There's also a challenge between kind of verifiable and validatable, and this is a little like, we could argue whether it's verifiable or not, but I think there are some assumptions that would still meet that could be used that would still meet that standard. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Emily. Floyd?
Just some quick responses. I would say that including counterfactuals for avoided methane is not the same as including land use change. I think those are two completely different topics, and so I'm not sure that's a fair analogy. On the other point, you know, California and other and the West Coast states include indirect land use change. That's true. That's a 5 billion gallon market on the West Coast. You're talking 50 times the volume in Vermont. So I just on a kind of a common sense basis, it just doesn't make sense to say, you know, let's apply the California ILUC values to Vermont. There's no possible way Vermont could have that impact on the global lipids market. It just, I mean, you could, like I said, I think Emily's right. You know, the question is, could you do it? And then the second question is, should you do it? And I think technically, yeah, you could do indirect land use change modeling. I don't dispute that. Should you do it? Is that a good use of Vermont's resources and the tag's time? I don't think it is, just because of the points we just talked about. I just cannot see any result coming out of that modeling being anything other than junk. I mean, it's junk in, junk out, right? And then there's the question of verifiability. You can verify that somebody did indirect land use change modeling. That doesn't mean you verified that the indirect land use change modeling results are correct. By the same token, you can certainly verify the direct emissions. You can verify the parameters that are specified that are important for calculating a CI score, the flow rate through a meter, the energy used for producing, you know, a widget of a fuel. All of those things are easily verifiable, and that goes through the verification process. There is no way to directly measure indirect land use change by definition. And so it just, you know, it seems inherently inconsistent with 8127.
Thank you.
One other note I would make is there's when Opinion Dynamics in their memo about this issue got to the land use change for wood, you know, for biomass fuels, they sort of said, well, we also don't know how to measure these, and we're going to exclude them because we're also excluding them for, you know, crop-based biofuels. So I did just want to note that this is an issue for wood too, which, you know, arguably there could be some, I'm not expert in this, maybe A&R can tell us, but there could be potentially some ways to track land use change impacts in Vermont forests. And there's a potential, a kind of, if we do it one way for crop-based biofuels, do we have to do the same thing for woody fuels, for which we might have different data sources and abilities? And is that okay? So I just wanted to, I guess, note that issue as well. That even though I think Floyd's write-up really focuses on the crop-based biofuel thing, but I think this is an issue for all biofuels.
Okay, Floyd, one more. And
just real
then-
quick on, and I'm no expert on woody biomass, but I would think that that's easily distinguishable. If you're taking wood from Vermont forest or somewhere nearby, you can easily measure that through surveys, satellite pictures, whatever. Indirect land use change is a completely different ballgame, right? You're talking about, hey, if I incentivize the use of biofuels in this state, somewhere in Indonesia or Brazil or wherever, you're going to have some farmers clearing off rainforests somehow in response to that. I think that's a completely different, prospect, and it's very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to estimate through, computer models, and whatever you get is going to be highly uncertain and subject to a lot of debate. So I hesitate to lump wood with the biofuel, the liquid and gaseous biofuels, just because they are such different animals.
Thanks. Okay, this is this discussion, like the earlier ones, is it's really confirming in me the approach we'll take next week and afterwards. On each of these matters, we'll have a few moments for the pros and the cons, you know, the prosecutors and the defendants, or the plaintiffs and the defendant, whatever. And the tag will then decide whether it, first of all, wants to take a vote, and then if it does, it'll take a vote. I think this is this process is now, we are refining our arguments. We're narrowing the issues in ways that I think will allow the tag to, you know, express itself in one way or another on the various issues. So I like that. We'll want to be as efficient and elegant as possible in those moments. So where we stand with this is, it sounds like Emily, you and Floyd are going to keep working on this document, and if possible, we'll have something to look at and chew on at our next meeting. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Right. Great. Okay. This is good. This is good.
Can I just clarify, Rick, timing on this? Because we have, like, you know, all these documents are being revised.
It'd be great to have the documents at least 2 days before the
Right,
tag.
that's what I was gonna ask, so that people can read them. I mean, if we have any chance of having a vote, I think people need the time to review them, or otherwise, I think we should, you know, we've sort of committed to the tag that they would have time to process
Yep.
after a discussion if they've seen it for the first time.
Yep. So let's aim for Tuesday. And if we can't do it on some of these, we can't. But that would be my aim for those of us who have committed to doing some editing and writing, to get them to you, to tag leadership by Tuesday, so they can be distributed before the end of the day. And that would give folks at least 24 hours to look at them. Lloyd's going to tell us, oh no.
Real quick procedural question, Rick. So I tried to capture the statutory language, just, you know, summarizing them, not citing them verbatim. I think there was some suggestions from Emily on this and the previous paper to include the statutory language in complete form. I didn't do that for brevity, and I'm not sure that's you know, I mean, I think the members can easily look up the language, especially if you're citing specific provisions. And I think that makes these things a little bit longer than they have to be. So I'm open to however you want to proceed, but
I leave it up to you. I'm not consistency of format in these documents is not something I'm going to strive for in the time that we've got. If you think that summarizing does the job, fine, with a footnote, or you want to stick it all in.
Or we can add the complete language at the end as an addendum or so. Okay.
I leave it to you and Emily to decide. Really, consistency in format would be nice, but in the time that we've got and all the work that you all have outside of tag matters, I'm not going to press it.
All right. Thank you.
But thank you. Okay. This is good. Well, thank you all. Thank you all. This has been good. As I say, I think we're sharpening the areas of I don't want to say contention, because it suggests that we're contentious, but the areas of disagreement, but there you go. Okay. We have 3 other things on our agenda. Now we're going to stop at 12 or sooner, that we just wanted to start talking about and thinking about what needs to happen with respect to. One is translating carbon intensities to credit values. Another one is identification of clean heat measures that will lower energy costs. There's a statement in the legislation, and it took me a little while to find it. But it has to do with meeting the low and moderate income objectives. We want to identify those installed measures that have lifetimes of at least 10 years that will reduce a household's energy costs. Presumably, obviously in relation to, the BAU. And the third one is we want to talk about the public health effects. In fact, the statute talks about benefits, but as we said, they can have negative benefits. So we're going to talk about the public health effects of CHS measures. Jared Ulmer is working on that for us as it stands. So we have nothing really at this point to discuss. But the other two we might want to say a word or two about. I have some thoughts about translating carbon intensities into credit values that I'd like to see if they withstand your scrutiny. Emily.
I have a couple of other process questions in terms of what we're going to cover at the next meeting. And one of them, I saw Brian has to jump off soon, so I was hoping to catch Brian. I know we have a lot of folks, and myself included, that are very interested in the woody biomass carbon intensity conversation, and I just wanted to check if ANR is planning to circulate a document and we will be able to review that. Like, is that actually on the docket for the next meeting or not?
Well, we hope it is, but I'll turn it to Brian.
That is our goal.
Okay, great. And so we have, the issues we just walked through, the counterfactuals and the land use change, and then the wood fuel carbon intensity issues that we haven't even had a chance to discuss today. So for those topics, I was just, Catherine had shared a draft agenda with me and Rick, and Catherine, you had us actually kind of voting on tag positions for the issues we had started to discuss at the last tag meeting, so advanced wood heat and the decline in CIs over time. But then you just had us kind of discussing these issues, the counterfactuals, the wood heat carbon intensities, and the land use change. So I just wanted to clarify, are we discussing and refining for those issues, or are we trying to actually vote on those?
Well, as I've said throughout this meeting today, Emily, if we can vote on them, great. If we can't, then we have to, postpone to the next.
I just wanted to double check because it wasn't.
Yeah. No, we're going to try to get everything on the agenda in one way or another. But if the tag, let's use, for example, this, the document on counterfactuals. If the tag is uncomfortable voting on it because of what it says or what the options are, we have to go back and refine it so that we are comfortable in taking a vote. But the hope is that we're going to get through as many of these as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I knew we were going to vote on them eventually. I just wasn't sure if the intention was to attempt to vote on them at the next meeting.
The hope is, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. No, thank you. Brian.
Yeah, so on that topic, I know we are kind of using this loose Robert's rules organization, in a more structured conversation. We would have a discussion, there would be a motion, we would have a discussion, there would be a motion to call the question, that would go to a vote. What is the process for deciding whether or not the tag is ready to vote on particular things or not? Like you said, when they get comfortable, that's a little hard for me to understand, like process-wise, how we are going to decide to move forward on a vote or not versus whether there'll be another iteration.
Well, that's a good question, Brian. That's a good, and I don't have an answer for it.
And that's fine for now, but I do want to understand. I think it's fair to everybody to understand how we are going to come to that conclusion before we launch on these discussions.
Well, we will for these, and Catherine's going to jump in here, but we will have formal motions on, whether to vote. That's for sure. But whether, well, Catherine, I'll turn it to you if you have some thoughts you want to add.
I would just add that in the past, if there has been even one member who did not feel ready to vote, we defer the vote. I mean, I think we cannot push members into voting when they're not ready. So I think if even one member suggested that they're not ready, they haven't had time to review the documents, they haven't had time to process the discussion, that would be a requirement to delay the vote. That would be my suggestion. And that's how it's worked in the past.
That seems fair. Catherine and I will put our heads together and offer a process when we talk next week.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Okay.
Can I just ask Brian for you to expand a little bit on what exactly you expect your memo to cover? Do we lose him?
But no, I'm still here. It covers the discuss. It's a little confusing because in the act it talks about, you know, emission factors for determining the clean heat credits and the carbon intensities, which is actually that threshold question, which doesn't apply to solid wood. No, it only applies to liquid and gaseous fuels, but we're kind of using them interchangeably. And in the table, the numbers are the same. But with that clarification, it is the treatment of wood fuels, wood biomass, and determining the appropriate methodology for determining its emission factor / carbon intensity for the purpose of earning credits or determining what credits are earned. And some of this is going to be related to it as these other papers have. It's to look back at the proposals that Opinion Dynamics has made, you know, in their emission factors memo and in their technical reference manuals related to wood fuels and to appliances, and to comment on those.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Well, that was, you know, that was a perfect segue for the into our next steps discussion. Thank you. So I just wanted to begin, or at least getting some thoughts on at least two of these matters. One, translating CIs to credit values, and then identification of of clean heat measures that will lower energy costs. I've been thinking about this question of translating carbon intensities into credit values for a while, and nothing has been particularly cogent or methodical. But let me just say a couple things, and people who've been giving more thought to this jump in and tell me where I've got it wrong. We have carbon intensities for clean heat measures, and let's think about, you know, an installed measure. You know, it's going to be expected to reduce X number of tons of carbon emissions per year, and it's going to live for 15 years. Isn't really the question there for determining what the credit values will be? It's really a question of how long-lived the measure is, right? It seems to me we know what a credit is. According to the rule, it's a metric ton of carbon emissions. Is the reduction of a metric ton, you get one credit for it. So I assume we're going to have fractions of credits. But if I got a long-lived measure, I can calculate how many credits it's going to produce. It seemed by just multiplying a couple numbers. Am I missing this? And once I do that, we now have the question of when the credits get issued. That seems to be part of this, or maybe not part of this question. So what am I missing? Brian.
Oh, I do have to go very shortly, so I'll get to talk and then I'm going to get to leave, which is exciting. I don't think you're missing too much, Rick. I think that, like, translation of carbon intensities to credit values, that's in the act, right? It's the, the life cycle emissions of the fuel use that's avoided minus the life cycle emissions of the fuel that's used instead. It's the same formula for both delivered and installed measures. The difference for installed measures is you have to project over the lifetime of the installed measure what the what's the fuel use that's avoided, and you need to make an assumption of what that's going to be. And I'm not going to look at it now, but I think it even says in the act that those credits for installed measures are allocated at the time the measures installed, and they're time stamped, and that, but you can only use them for the timestamp that they're good for.
So I know what they're going to be the moment I install the measure, but the ones that are timestamped for 4 years from now, I can only use 4 years from now.
That's the way I understand the act to look.
That's
Yes.
what I've understood too, generally. Yeah, okay. So that's fairly straightforward.
But the complexities in the conversations we're having now, it's like, what is the carbon intensity of the fuel that's used instead? Because I think we're not really debating the carbon intensity of the fuel use that's being avoided. I think the opinion dynamics has said for the fuel use that's avoided, it's impractical to, do that on an installation by installation basis, even though that data, I think is going to be available. These measures will be installed, but my understanding is that that's administratively overly burdensome. And so we're going to use some kind of an average for the fuel use that's avoided for both delivered and installed measures. And then we're having a discussion about what's the carbon intensity of the fuel that's used instead and what those numbers are going to be. But once we determine what they are, yes, you're right. It's simply arithmetic.
Yep.
And with that, I will bid you all a good morning.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Okay, it's nice every now and then to have one's impressions confirmed. Okay, does anybody else have any thoughts on this question? I'm looking at Matthew. We'd think the department has paid some attention to this, but if we're sort of on the right track, I'll go back to our list of tasks and see if there's anything more we need to say about this at this time. Matthew, do you want to jump in? If not, just shake your head.
Sure. I think the only point where the department is unclear on multi-year measure savings is in the event that the new fuel has a changing CI over time. So I think simplicity says you just assume it is what it is at the time of installation based on the timestamp, and then you get a forward-looking vintage for each year. But based on the draft rule, I think we're looking at the simpler approach rather than trying to do any sort of modification of credit values based on realities that happen later.
Right. And that's a typical approach in programs that do have long lives and deemed savings and that sort of thing. And you just, yeah. Floyd.
Just a quick question, and I admit I'm no expert on the installed measures. Most equipment have a degradation rate. Is that factored into, you're talking about upfront calculations. I assume that's constant moving forward, or is there a degradation assumed that's standard practice with virtually all equipment?
Again, I'll turn to Matthew and others, but always as a matter of planning for efficiency programs, persistence, and that's part of this. Persistence rates are calculated, and in other words, things that are supposed to have 15-year lives on average have 13.5-year lives or something like that. So that'd be one area where, with respect again to planning for efficiency programs under integrated resource plans and Efficiency Vermont, you take that into account. If you're talking about the degradation of the efficiency of the appliance itself, that's a question for EBT and the department. Matthew, do you know offhand how that's dealt with?
I believe in the draft TRM, it is not dealt with. So whether or not that's reflected in uneffective useful life rather than unexpected useful life, I think that's something the tag can obviously chime in on. If they see a factor that's missing in the calculations in the TRM, that's something that should be pointed out.
Good point. Well, let's make sure we, well, let me see, Adam Sherman's on the phone, although deals with wood, but I'll make sure Emily Roscoe gets that question, and obviously, Matthew, you can chat with your folks in the efficiency division, see if there's a thought there. That'd be great. Okay, and just lastly on this agenda, we need to say something about clean heat measures that will lower energy costs. And that seems, again, to be a fairly straightforward calculation, again, based on, expectations for how installed measures will perform. I think this is particularly about installed measures, although I suppose it could be true of delivered measures too, if delivered fuels are being provided at a lower expected cost than the fuel they replace. That might be harder to, but delivered measures aren't considered to be, anything more than 1 year of lifetime. So I guess they're automatically excluded. Does the TRM as it stands now doesn't make any statements, does it, about cost savings? It talks about cost, but not necessarily cost savings. It makes no judgments about electric prices versus expected fuel prices. Is that correct? Okay, if that's correct, we would need to actually do some work on what the potential cost savings are for long-lived CH measures, clean heat measures. And that's not something the tag itself can do. So we might want to think about how that work gets done. Floyd, I'll ask around, I'll talk to some folks and see. Certainly we know that the PUC is doing an economic analysis, which might have some relevance to this question, but I'll do some poking around. Floyd.
Yeah, and I don't know if this point is moot based on the statutory requirements, but Clean Cities puts out their reports and has consistently shown, given the right policy signals, biodiesel consistently is sold at a price advantage relative to petroleum diesel, so it's lower cost. And then renewable diesel is at price parity with petroleum diesel.
Thanks. Okay. Unless there's anything more on that, I'll say that we've covered everything on this agenda, and we've got our marching orders. We have a few moments. I would like to open this up for some public comment at this point, which we've got time for that. So if there are any members of the public who'd like to speak, have any thoughts, we're glad to hear them. Mr. Porter.
Yeah, I'll probably reserve most of my comments until these documents are published on the PUC site or the website, and I think if I understood correctly, that'll be by Tuesday. I'd ask Adam Sherman to provide the link to the actual document from which that screenshot came from so that we can review the actual document. In terms of the OD modeling, last time I spoke with y'all, I and others asked for a link to the actual modeling, and that has not been provided. So the public has still not been able to see the underlying assumptions, et cetera, that went into the OD calculations. And as just a final quick note, you could cut 40 acres of forest land, and that would not be a land use change. That is just, could be considered forest degradation, but it wouldn't be a land use change. If that land were turned into, say, residential housing, then it would be a land use change. But just wanted to point that out based on something Mr. Well, I don't know how to pronounce that last name, Floyd mentioned earlier.
Just
Thank you.
a response that Deirdre did post the link that the public has access to the OD worksheets. And I'm looking for her email to make sure I can find out where I think she posted it with materials from that meeting where it was discussed. So I'd
Yes.
ask. So it should be there, and she said it is accessible and members of the public have already accessed it successfully.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'll go try and track it down.
It's on the page for last week's meeting. I believe it's, or possibly the meeting before that. I can't remember now. I think it was last week's meeting. And you'll see 5 links. One of them is a hyperlink. The other 2 you're going to have to copy, and the other 4 you have to copy and paste.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anthea,
I just pasted that link in the chat.
thanks, Matthew.
Waiting
Anthea.
for my video to turn on. Thank you. I will not take much of your time. I will try and be brief as I usually am. To the extent that it is helpful to, in addition to what I hope continue to be very neutral recitations of the arguments on the different sides of these issues, CLF has filed a couple comments on some of the topics that you were discussing that I would encourage members of the TAG to review. And I'm just going to put in a plug again for the charts that we submitted in our September 10th filing, which I think provide a kind of useful visual representation, knowing that obviously there may be technological advances, but looking at the CIs that came from opinion dynamics and what some of the different decision points that you have in front of you might do looking out to 2050. And hopefully they'll be useful as you go through your analysis. And thank you for the work that you're doing on this.
And thank you. Much appreciated. Okay. If there's nothing else, I want to say thank you to everyone, public, TAG members, for your hard work, patience, and input. Enjoy the day and the weekend, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. Take care, all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.